All right, so I'm going to try to talk very briefly about food safety and its intersection with agricultural water, as well as some water quality considerations as it relates to irrigation as well. So I have like a full, not full, this is like a really poor man's chemistry kit set up in front of us, which we will get to in just a moment when we start talking about water quality considerations. But first, food safety and ag water. Ag water is a really weird term. What do you think falls under the umbrella of ag water, agricultural water?
Anything in the watershed of the farm.
So yeah, let's identify some of those things.
So streams and lakes and ponds nearby.
Not even from this perspective. No, that would be like one, unless you're using that as your source for other water-related activities. So we talked about irrigation all morning. If you spray anything on your crops, foliar applications of fertility, pesticides of any sort, all of that water that contacts crops is considered agricultural water. And
With the pesticide in it, or
yes, exactly, yep. And so that kind of all falls under the category of production-related water. And then there's post-harvest water as well. And post-harvest water is probably a little bit more obvious what we're talking about, which is anything for wash and pack, including ice, if you do anything with ice, which I don't think, you don't do any ice, right? So we won't talk about ice. Yes, all right. So, and the reason they make that distinction is there are different kind of expectations for what you need to do to make sure that you're using safe, clean, sanitary water for those different operations. And when we're talking about safe, clean, sanitary water, what we're typically talking about is E. coli, all right? And why do we talk about E. coli in this context?
Why do we talk about it?
Yeah.
Because it's a pathogen.
Well, there are lots of types of E. coli. There's one type of E. coli specifically as a pathogen, and it represents, where does E. coli come from, the pathogenic E. coli? Poop. Exactly, thank you. It comes from poop. Yeah, it's associated with the gastrointestinal system of warm-blooded animals, which means it can be kind of a metric that we look at that represents more broadly what might be fecal contamination of our water supply. In other words, poop. We're looking for poop, always, all right? So what do you think with production water? You worried about E. coli in your production water, irrigation water, all that stuff? I mean, you're on municipal, so you don't even care about this, right? You've got chlorinated, treated water.
We had one scare. Oh, it wasn't a scare. Our city actually had E. coli, E. coli spike. So that's actually when we found out that we were on the town water. So we weren't affected by it.
So you have your, right, it's not city of Poughkeepsie water.
We're actually town of Poughkeepsie water.
Ah, interesting, okay. And Sarah, you're on a well? Okay, right. So the other thing that we have to start thinking about, which is what you originally were talking about in terms of production water, is it a surface source of water? Is it a groundwater source from a well, assuming it's like a well-cased, well-capped well? Or is it surface water, right? So I think some of the people who were here earlier are pulling out of ponds. You pull out of a pond as well, all right? So you have that luxury of enjoying all the food safety stuff that comes along with surface water sources. And so it's pretty obvious, right? It's which is the highest risk of those three, of groundwater, of surface water, or municipal water, of having E. coli in it? Surface water, right? Because it comes from animals. So if you have a huge population of geese that are all pooping around that water, there are more risks that come with using that water, but there are strategies that you can use to minimize the risk, even if you do have higher levels of E. coli than you'd like to see in your water. So how do you know if you have E. coli in your water?
You get it tested.
Get it tested. It's as simple as that. So do you do a test, or you just depend on the town water tests?
Yeah, they do periodic tests.
Sarah, do you do any testing, or?
The last last one was a year ago, so I need to do another one. How
Okay.
regularly should we do it? Yearly or?
It depends on what you're trying to do.
Oh, not killing people.
Yes, thank you. No, we appreciate you not killing people. Talking about food safety is often the last thing people want to think about, especially I think smaller farms who feel like their risk pool of people that they're feeding is smaller as well, and they're also more intimately aware of everything that's happening on their farm because it's a smaller amount of area to be aware of. But you still, as organic growers, want to make sure that you're providing a healthful product to your consumers, and this is part of that, right? So if you want to make sure you're providing a healthful product to your consumers and you have a well-encased, well-capped well, once a year during the production season is probably enough just to meet that goal. Now, if we were to start talking about Food Safety Modernization Act or having a food safety plan for gaps, you would have different expectations and how to establish a baseline of what your generic E. coli levels are and how to continue testing for that water over time. But if that's your goal, I think that's a great place to start. But then the question arises of what kind of tests are you doing? And have you started delving into this? So what kind of test for E. coli are you using for your surface water?
The generic E. coli, and they have a list. I didn't put it in the packet, but there's like 8 or 9 approved tests, so it was one of those.
Yeah. And so that's for Food Safety Modernization Act
But
compliance
it's also
specific.
for organic certification.
Right.
We just finished getting certified, so we had to do it for both.
Yeah. And so I think it's a giant pom-pom. What I'll leave it at is that if you're interested in getting any sort of certification or the regulatory compliance side of food safety as it relates to agricultural water, the devil's in the details. It depends on what source, whether it's surface well or municipal. That will determine what sort of tests you need, how frequently you need to take those tests. But then also GAPS is different. And then organic certification is different. So if you think you're going to want to comply or certify in any of those things, it's really helpful to know, is there one that you can do to kill 3 birds or 2 birds with 1 stone when it comes to testing? So what is generally recommended is a generic E. coli. There's a 1603 method that was the original one that was allowed, but there are now like 9 or so methods, which is nice. If anyone is interested, I can hook you up with labs that are nearby that have approved testing methods that are allowed under the Food Safety Modernization Act that give you that generic E. coli quantitative reading, okay? I think that's probably, yeah, go ahead. Questions, please, because this is, I could talk all day, bore you all to death.
I asked the DEC person, our properties manager at the DEC, where she goes, so I assume it's probably good enough. But are you familiar with EnviroTest Laboratories in Newburgh?
Yes.
Is that a good one?
Yes, but again, you have to know which, they provide a whole slew of water quality and
Which-
testing services.
tests.
Yes. And so if you'd like, I can email you the list of approved generic E. coli, or Mary Ellen, or anyone can, so you don't have to dig it up and look it up. But yes, so they do a couple, I think they actually do the 1603, but they also do a couple other generic E. coli tests.
I was surprised at how clean our pond water was, and apparently a lot of upstate New York is like super clean. So we had
Really?
no E.
Oh.
coli.
Really? No detectable?
No detectable.
Yes, no
And they said that
detectable.
was
Yeah.
like pretty standard.
Yeah.
For the ones that they're doing.
Huh.
So
And so that's important to keep in mind too, in case anyone's ever in a situation where you are pulling from surface water especially, is that the reason that there are expectations for more frequent testing for surface water is you might have pristine, beautiful, no detectable E. coli 99% of the time, but again, you get a flock of geese that like moves in and poops a lot, and then you get a big rainstorm after that, and suddenly you get this huge load of E. coli. Yeah.
No pun intended.
A big load. And so thankfully, all of the things that people might take issue with the Food Safety Modernization Act, they do try to account for what might be high spikes from a certain incident and allow you to take corrective measures to try to bring that back to acceptable levels. So
Is there like
go ahead.
is there an affordable UV system for like irrigation water?
for UV, no, not that I know of. But Chris Callahan from the University of Vermont is starting to work on some of these water quality issues for smaller scale mixed vegetable operations. So if you, since you brought it up, there are a lot of different ways if you do have detectable E. coli in your water source and you're above the threshold for what you need to be for production water, which is pretty high. There are a lot of different options you have. Okay, so let's talk about some of those options. You can use UV treatment. What else can you do to bring E. coli loads down in your water?
You can water certain number of days prior to harvest, right?
Yeah, and so that's not changing the water, that's changing the way you use that water.
Yes,
There are two approaches in that situation. One, you can change the quality of the water itself and then use it how you originally intended. Or two, what you're talking about is changing how you're using it. And what does that look like? It could mean, we talked a lot about overhead irrigation today. If you have sweet corn that you have on drip instead of overhead irrigation, you're reducing the risk as well, just by keeping that water off the edible portion of that crop. You can irrigate a certain number of days out, and the science behind that is that ultraviolet irradiation does kill most microbes over a period of time, okay? And so that allows for desiccation, UV irradiation to bring those pathogen loads down. That's why they allow that 5-day window. There is some science to it. It wasn't like someone just flipped a coin and said 5 days or 7 days, I don't know.
But that's just your irrigation water, it's not your wash water.
Your wash water has to have no detectable E. coli. Yes, okay, so your wash water is and that's why we made that distinction right at the outset between your post-harvest water and your production water. So as it pertains to production water right now, yes, there is, I think it's 126 CFUs of generic E. coli after you put it into the computer program that takes your mean over a certain number of tests that you have to be under, all right? But so UV radiation is one. So what else could we do if we wanted to actually change the E. coli load in the water, not just change how we're using it to get around it?
Do people chlorinate?
Yes, absolutely. Anything else?
Like small farms will chlorinate their water?
Some. I think what's more typical is the third option, which is using sanitizers. Okay, so
Even in the irrigation.
in the irrigation is less frequent.
Okay.
Yes, much less frequent. In the irrigation, I haven't heard of anyone needing to do anything to the irrigation water other than perhaps change the way they're using it to be compliant with whether it's GAPS or FSMA. Because usually, again, it's like it's rare the number of growers who are out there irrigating 2 or 3 days before harvest, depending upon your crop. But that's rare. And if they are, they're probably using drip irrigation, and so there's reduced risk there. Which again, depending on if you're talking about Food Safety Modernization Act or GAPS, there's different flexibility to kind of accommodate those different approaches. But certainly when we're talking about post-harvest water, the sanitation, sanitizing, using things like Sanidate, Tsunami, any of the typically either chlorine-based products or peroxyacetic acid products, any of those are allowed. And there are specific ones, if you are certified organic, that are OMRI approved, Sanidate being one of them, Tsunami as well. But if you're conventional or certified naturally grown, then some of the sodium hypochlorite products are cheaper.
Have you run into situations where people are using surface water to wash their vegetables?
I have not personally.
Oh, okay.
No. But I think that it's written in there for a reason. I would assume that it's been an issue at some point somewhere. Yeah. So, other questions specifically as it pertains to this? I mean, we could talk in more detail about the specific requirements of the different sort of regulations or voluntary certifications that are out there, but I think it'd probably be more useful to hear what specific questions or concerns you have from this perspective and try to address them, if you have any.
I wonder about, well, I was just thinking about sanitation, and maybe I went in a different direction, but I was just curious because my staff has been wanting to upgrade our baby greens drying situation, and I have used, old laundry machines, and I'm not really yucked out by the dirty clothes. I more wonder about like all the different detergents that have been there. Do you know anything about if that's safe or not?
Yeah, so I think the standard answer on this from inspectors is no, they don't want to see you using an old,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, laundry machine.
That's
But
what I was crazy to say.
there are companies that are now making similar designs that are not actually old laundry machines. Upstream Ag from Vermont is one of them that's doing a nice one. I think In the Field Consultants guy is making one as well.
Well, I think if you modify a washing machine where you're basically just using the motor and you have a sanitizable basket that you can
Yes.
remove and clean, then I think that's fine, right?
Yes, and so the question becomes, especially when looking at, again, we could talk for hours about kind of like wash station design, pack house design as it pertains to food safety, but especially like areas that are hard to sanitize, enclosed things like, you know, the casing of a washing machine. If you strip that down and use the motor and use the base and somehow modify, you know, I've seen people just use like 55-gallon, you know, Rubbermaid, basically trash cans that are sanitizable, right? And then having a plan that you actually do sanitize those surfaces and that you use sanitizer in the water being used to clean those greens. That's what they would want to see, all of those things. And so do either of you use sanitizer solution in any of your water? You do. What are you using?
We have Sanidate. I think that's what we have. Is Oxidate, that's something different?
Oxidate is the same active ingredients but not labeled for use on surfaces or in wash water.
We have
Yeah.
Sanidate,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. And we've been using it because we sell lettuce to the schools and they asked us to.
Yeah.
We probably should use it on everything.
Right. Well, and so this is where, again, like if you get into the details of the Food Safety Modernization Act, for batch water, things that are getting multiple loads of produce washed in it,
Yeah.
not single pass systems, there are expectations that you use a sanitizer. And that it's very important to clarify that when we're talking about sanitizers, we're not talking about something that's cleaning the product. It needs to be clean already before it. What the sanitizer does is it basically helps stop the spread of pathogens that might be in that batch water to infest other produce in that batch water. All right? But so they take, and none of this is laid out because it's all very subjective. So you have to come up with a plan that makes sense for your operation, the way you're doing things, which is how often do you need to change that batch water? What's the answer to that?
Whatever makes sense.
Whatever makes sense, but what makes sense? And that's where, so they need you to have something that you can keep records on that is somewhat less than just saying, I don't know, whenever I feel like it. So there are considerations for turbidity, basically like what the load of dirt and sediment in that water is, and they sell discs that are certain colors that you can kind of submerge in that water, that once you can't see that anymore, you say, oh, it's too turbid now we have to change our batch water. In general, why do we worry about having a lot of organic matter or soil in our batch water?
It deneutralizes the chemical.
Exactly, yeah. Everything we've talked about that is a sanitizer gets taken up by organic matter.
Especially bleach, right?
Especially
That's the
bleach.
worst.
And so the reason we have this chemistry set out here as well is one of the things that you can do to make sure that whatever sanitizer you decide to use is actually working is test. Test to make sure that whatever you're putting in that water is actually available, all right? And so I have a lot of stuff out here and I don't want it to be intimidating because people immediately start to say, oh my God, I have to test for chlorine availability. I'm not a chemist, I'm a farmer. But let's say you're using chlorine. These strips are like $4 for a pack of, I don't know how many come in here, 100 strips. All right, so this is just a simple chlorine. Has anyone used stuff like this? How do you test for?
We change our batch water all the time.
There you go. That's.
We have a lot of water.
Is that one reasonable answer to say I've tested my water and it has no E. coli and so we just change it every single time and put new producing?
I would guess that they would still want you to use a sanitizer because it's not as much in that, from that perspective. Again, the sanitizer isn't to try to treat the water in that case. The sanitizer is if a goose flies over or a duck flies over or a deer is in your field and poops on a head of lettuce and you miss it. You know, there are all these steps that you're supposed to do to try to prevent harvesting that contaminated produce.
Yeah.
But there's an understanding that there's a need for checks and balances because it's an operating farm and you're going to occasionally miss the poop-laden lettuce head and it's going to end up in your batch water. All right, and so what can you do then to try to prevent that spread of potential pathogens in that contaminated produce to everything else that's in that batch water? So from that perspective, even if you're changing it every time, yes, that limits the total risk pool, for contaminating multiple loads that are going through that wash system, but it doesn't do anything to stop the spread within that batch water. So it's still best, to make sure that whatever you have in there is actually effective. So my guess is that this is not going to do anything, because I actually just pulled this water sample from the water fountain over there. And so there are very strict rules about how much chlorine can be in potable water, all right? So all you would need to do is submerge this test strip for 20 seconds or so, and then compare it to the handy dandy thing on the side, and we're maybe at 0. There's like a hint of blue in there. I would guess it's probably around 3 parts per million, which is not uncommon for potable water coming from a municipal source. And that's where, if you can show that and you know that you have that coming into it, that's helpful. But it also, depending upon the amount, the concentration of a sanitizer that you're using, it's going to determine what you can use to actually track whether you have it available. This is the cheap way to do it, and it's easy, and you just dip it and you're done. But our next interval is 25 parts per million. All right, which is above potable limits for chlorine concentration in water. Now, if you have your own injector in a system, which again, you showed off your fertilizer injector system, you can rig up something essentially identical for a wash station to inject chlorine or Sanidate or whatever sanitizer you want to use at a consistent rate and dilution. So you can dial that in, and it can, for the processes of post-harvest water, be much higher than 3 ppm. There's actually, as far as I know, no upper limit, which is a little disconcerting.
For post-harvest?
Yes.
Other than, organic, it's whatever, it comes out of the end product. So
Yes.
you're mixing that with water to get it down to 4.
Yes. Yeah. So there are a number of different, strips like that depending upon the sanitizing agent that you're using. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is the influence of pH, the pH of the water, on the availability and activity of some of these sanitizers as well. So chlorine, what do you think? Do we want a high pH or low pH for it to work really well?
Higher.
Higher?
I mean, lower, that's what I meant.
No, you said higher, Leon.
I was thinking more acidic.
Let's back up. What's pH? Who's had chemistry more recently than I have?
Isn't it the measure of hydrogen ions?
Yeah.
Yes. That's impressive, Leon.
That's my brewing knowledge.
All right, and so if we have a higher concentration of H+ ions in our water, for example, are we going to have a lower pH or a higher pH?
Higher. I mean, lower. More acidic is what I was thinking.
Yes. If you have more H+ ions in solution, you have a more acidic pH, which is lower. So where's neutral? 7. And so anything below 7 is
Higher.
acidic. Yes. I can tell both of you have had chemistry much more recently than anyone else in this room, so please speak up. And above 7 is
Lower.
basic or alkaline. Yeah, and this is where it gets really tricky with the terminology. Is yes, that's a perfectly acceptable colloquial term for a basic solution, but it gets really confusing because we're going to get into alkalinity testing in a second, which is different. All right, just to blow everyone's minds after lunch, yeah. Sodium hypochlorite and other bleach or chlorine products are more available at slightly acidic levels. So typically, if you're using any sort of chlorine product as a sanitizer, you want to bring your pH down to 6 to 6.2, somewhere in that range. But how do we know what our pH is to start?
Check it.
Yeah. More strips, more strips. Or if you're putting a soil test in and you have a consistent pH over time, which pH can change a little bit, but is often not as susceptible to huge spikes as something like E. coli. The same lab that's going to do your generic E. coli testing can do a pH test for you to at least understand kind of like what your rough baseline is. But there are all sorts of other ways you can test your pH. Yes, there we go. All right, your rough and dirty pH strip, just like we use for chlorine availability. This one has 4 squares you get to look at. It's that much more interesting and fun. The camera should probably zoom in on that. So again, you just submerge this in your water sample for about 20 seconds or so. And then there are a number of farmers that I work with who didn't know that they were colorblind until I started trying to work with them on these pH strips. They're like, I keep getting 14. Is that possible? It's like something's really, really wrong. All right, so we can actually pass this around and just, I'll make sure I put the top back on it. And you can see how useful or not useful this actually is to figure out what your precise pH is. Because remember, I said your kind of target pH for chlorine availability and activity is around 6 to 6.2. Do you see a 6.2 on there anywhere?
So you would want to lower your pH in your wash water until it's at the right point so
Yes.
the chlorine can be available?
Yes. How do you do that?
How do you do that? You add
So-
like 80%.
Oh, yeah, that's tough to come down from. Yeah. So, Leon, do you acidify any of your water?
No,
You're still looking for 6.2, aren't you?
it's definitely closer to 7.
Yes, yeah. Which again, for a municipal water source, I would expect it to be around 7.
Do you remember what our pH was when we had the test?
Is it the same water that comes out of here?
Yeah.
We'll find out in a second.
No.
So do you acidify any of your water for anything? You don't. Okay. There are a number of different things you can do. Organically, the most common thing to add is citric acid. And there are citric acid formulations that are developed specifically to be soluble and are OMRI approved for use in organic systems. And not that we're talking about pesticide use at the moment, but especially for some of the pyrethrin-based organic insecticides like Pyganic, for example, they're much more effective at lower pHs as well. So I've talked to a number of growers who say, it keeps spraying Pyganic and doesn't seem to do anything. I have a pH of 8.5. What's going on? It's like, well...
Where should it be for Pyganic? It's like 6 something, right?
Ideal for most pyrethroids, whether they're conventional or organic formulations, is, around 6. And so that information is always on the pesticide label, and you must follow the pesticide label. Let me just make sure I get that on camera. But yeah, generally with pyrethroids, if you can acidify it, even below 6, they're that much more effective. Now that's not true for every chemical, but it is true for pyrethroids
So that
at
would
least.
probably be the only reason why we would, I think, acidify anything here. I think that would be the only reason why I would think about acidifying something
Acidifying,
here.
yes, yeah.
Because I think our pH is probably around 7.
It's around 7. And so if you didn't want to use chlorine as a sanitizer, you wouldn't have to. Because if you look at things like Sanidate, the label actually says 7 is fine. It's perfectly active and available at a pH of 7. So that's where, getting into what is my cost for a sanitizing solution? What concentration do I need it to be available at? How am I going to be testing to make sure that's active and available in the water when I am sanitizing it? And then if some of my constraints lead me to say this is pointless, all I'm going to do is be injecting 7 things into my wash water that I don't want to have to buy and I don't want to have to test for, is there an alternative, which is maybe using Sanidate in this case?
Yeah.
All right.
Is Sanidate as caustic as
Oxidate?
oxidate?
I think it's more caustic.
It's more caustic,
Yeah,
yes.
so you just got to be so careful using that stuff. That's like the one chemical that we use that could really give you a serious burn.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is a serious oxidizer. When it was first labeled for use in New York State, it was actually a restricted use pesticide because of the fact that it's such an extreme oxidizer. Okay, and so what I want to be very clear about with this is that when we're talking about sanitizing solutions, we're talking about pesticides. And when we're talking about pesticides, we have to talk about worker protection standards and worker safety as well, which means that that's an expectation now through the APA annual training of farm employees in an area where any pesticides have been used, where a re-entry interval has been in place in the last 30 days. So if you're using Sanidate, you're using any of these pesticides as a sanitation solution, then you need to be training your workers to be safe in that environment.
Do you have to label? Do you have to, if you use Sanidate in your wash station, do you have to put a pesticide.
You need a central posting
warning?
station. You need
Really?
to post its use, the concentration.
I
You
never
need
thought
to have the
about that.
label on file, all of that stuff.
Safety data sheets.
Absolutely, your MSDS. You just came to the training. Someone's showing off a little bit.
So is there, I have actually looked at the standard label, but a lot of it's like wear gloves and that kind of thing.
Yep.
And I remember I went a while ago to, actually at the Farm Hub, this tree where they showed a GAP certified, like very, very moderate wash station. I saw down there too. And the sanity that they had there, they had some way of measuring it that was attached to the actual container that looked like it prevented, you didn't have to open
Yep.
the container.
Yep.
Okay. Is that something, I can't remember if you made it or bought it.
There are closed mixing systems. That's what you would need to look at. And there are a whole bunch of different designs that are available. But what I will say is that even when using a closed mixing system, there are expectations for personal protective equipment. Some labels will have modified PPE requirements if you're using a closed mixing system, but some will not. Again, with the understanding that if that malfunctions for whatever reason and you're like leaning over a container of Sanidate and blows out, you want to be prepared to protect yourself. So, and that's important to note as well, that the concentrated forms of these things are the most risky to use, right? So it's not to say there's no risk once it's in the batch water, but it's also one of the reasons that, Leon, I was really disappointed that you didn't talk about calibration of your fertigation system. Do you ever calibrate?
No, I probably should.
Probably should. And I should have sent this to you to make copies in advance, but I didn't. Yeah. But this is kind of a step-by-step system for calibrating any sort of injection system. And this is specific for this one for a fertigation system. But basically, there are a lot of different ways that you can test that. You have that very precise dial that dictates what ppm concentration of material is going into that system. But any number of things can go wrong, especially as that system ages, whether it's filter clogs, whether it's just some of the dials wearing, that can actually really radically change how much is getting put out.
That's where the leaf tissue sampling.
That can help. But the other thing that helps you is that you're only mixing up a stock solution to inject for that specific fertigation. There are a lot of growers that have a huge stock tank that it's just in, that it will pull from for however long that system.
So when
would
they
allow
make
it
that
to.
stock tank, so that could be like a whole season.
Not a whole season usually, but it can be a month. Yeah. So, so that's just to say too, if you're going to use an injection system for your sanitizer, it's good, one, to have the check of making sure that it's available, and that would usually be your first red flag. You'd suddenly see you have 300 ppm of chlorine in your stock water. But just using a calibrator as well to get that. So Leon asked what the pH of his water was, and we used the strips. What's the consensus? What do you think your pH was? What do we think? Do you remember at this point? 14? No.
No, actually, the strips.
Yeah. 7? It looked like 7? Is that consensus? So this keeps creeping up. There are a number of different pH meters that are on the market. This is one that is actually a dual meter that measures both pH and has the option of measuring electrical conductivity, which is really handy because you can use it to test for salt concentration or salt buildup in high tunnels, which I think we'll talk about when we go back outside in a couple minutes. But it can also be used, a lot of these calibration methods that are here is if you know what the electrical conductivity of your final solution is once it has the fertilizer in it, you can just record that, and you can use this to just make sure that it's injecting the right concentration of that material. But with the pH readings, they just like wander around a lot, and you never quite know when to just call it. It looks like you're around 7.2, I'd say. So that's where some of the specifics, how much different is 7.2 versus 7? Well, it's 0.2 different, of course. pH is logarithmic, so the difference between 6 and 7 is 100-fold. So 0.2 is actually more significant in terms of concentration of hydrogen ions than we might initially think. It might not be that big of a deal in terms of, in practice, how you're using it. Any questions? about any of this? Am I covering the stuff more or less that you were hoping? All right, the last thing then that I'll do before I stop talking, we can go back out to the high tunnels, is talk about what you brought up, alkalinity. So, what is alkalinity? High pH. Agree or disagree?
It's the concentration of, not calcium chloride, but it's the concentration of, it's your hardness, isn't it?
Yes.
You could have temporary or permanent hardness, which is measurement of calcium.
Bicarbonate.
Bicarbonate, thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So this is where it gets really confusing. Is again, colloquially, often people refer to high pH water as being alkaline water. Okay, and that's because often hard water that has a lot of limestone load in it, depending upon, especially if you're pumping out of a well that has like a limestone bedrock, you can get a lot of dissolved bicarbonate in that water from that limestone source. But it doesn't always mean you actually have a high pH. I've tested a lot of water samples from the area that have a very high alkalinity, but their pH is in like the 7.2 to 7.3 range. Okay, but so what does that influence? Hard water. What does that actually do to you or me or anything on the farm? Any of your
buffer.
ag water? It's a buffer. What does that mean? You're just throwing
So-
lingo out now. It's a buffer. Put it on your glossary again.
You would need more acid to bring the pH down if you have
Yes.
hard water
Absolutely. Yep.
than you would if it was not hard.
Yep.
If it wasn't a lot of, if there wasn't a lot of alkalinity.
Yeah. So let's say we're in your situation. You have pH of 8, 9. Is that what you said? Oof.
Almost not legal to drink.
And let's say we really wanted to use chlorine as our sanitizer, and we wanted to get our pH down to 6.
We add a lot of acid.
Yeah, but do we know how much? It would really depend on what your alkalinity of that water is.
It's also very high.
I would imagine. Do you know how high it is up
I
top?
don't remember.
Yeah.
It's up there.
Yeah. Does anyone know what the measurement for alkalinity
Going
is?
to-
I don't know that one. That's like old school. Someone's
Yeah,
like
that's
out
the
there.
measure. I don't have to measure it.
We usually talk about it in ppm, parts per million, okay? And so average-ish is around 75 to 100 ppm of alkalinity, total alkalinity, which is mostly calcium bicarbonate, again, from limestone in your water source, all right? I've seen samples from Orange County that are 350, 360, really alkaline water, because they have a layer of basically calcium bicarbonate clay slurry that is kind of underneath that muck soil. And so if their well depth is right around there and they're pulling from that, it's high, which means if they are trying to buffer, which is impacting the pH, if they're trying to acidify their water, they have to add more product to bring it down than someone that would have an alkalinity of, say, 75 ppm, even if their pH is identical. Okay? And that's why the distinction is subtle but very important. So how do we measure alkalinity?
You get a
Test.
water test.
That's the easiest way to do it, or you can call your extension specialist who happens to have a titration kit. So this is an alkalinity titration kit, and this is just real basic chemistry what we're going to do here, which is we have a 100 milliliter sample of water, and we're going to dump in a reagent, which basically just colors the water and reacts with what we're going to add into this. Anyone want to guess what we might be adding into this?
Acid.
Yeah, strong acid. This is sulfuric acid, all right? So depending upon the kit you get, depending upon the concentration of sulfuric acid you have in the syringe, there are different protocols for how you use this. But basically what we do is we now have, what would you call that, teal water. We stick this in here, and this is going to very precisely inject sulfuric acid at a known rate into this concentration. And as I'm spinning this dial, this meter is counting how many drops of sulfuric acid are going into this solution. Anyone want to throw out a guess on, oh, we're getting close. That's close. Anyone want to guess what our alkalinity is going to be in this town water?
60.
Yeah, that's... So you want it to stabilize eventually, and, you know, getting super precise isn't that important. You typically, like a 10 ppm range is fine. We ended up around 75. So that's really low. That's really low alkalinity.
Yeah, because our water comes from,
Is it a reservoir?
actually I'm not sure. I'm not sure where the town water comes from. I think the city water comes from springs in the Hudson, I think.
Yeah,
I think, doesn't it?
yeah. City was, that's why they got the salt.
They're not pulling from the Hudson, but it's like springs that feed the Hudson or something.
Yeah, there we go. I should have told everyone to bring water samples. We could have had a, yeah. Well, if you'd like to, yeah, we can stay afterward for more fun and entertainment. More alkalinity testing for all. There are also digital meters that you can buy that are a little bit more expensive, and you have to buy a nice one for it to give you an accurate and precise reading. So this is why it's still kind of the preferred method to get fairly accurate reading, which seems like I'm just old school and I like spinning this little meter and looking at it, but no. It's about the quality of our work. So
This is useful so that if you did want to change your pH, you would
Yes.
understand exactly how hard it's going to be and how much acid you have to add.
exactly, yep, yep. And again, just to be precise with the language around alkalinity versus what's basic versus what's, yeah, and that's where it gets really confusing for everyone. Yep.
You can also just get a water test.
You can also just get a water test,
They're
but
like-
still you have
they're
to know
like
what you're
20
looking
bucks.
at. Yeah, yeah. And you have a preferred test that you like. You like to get the brewer's test, right?
Yeah,
Wanna talk
some
about why?
companies, what was that company, Waters?
That was Waters Agricultural Labs
Yeah.
who ran that. Yeah.
Yeah,
You
you
mentioned
can-
earlier for tissue sampling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can send in a water sample. You just get like they can send you a bottle, or you just get a, small 12 ounce, I guess, water bottle. They don't need a full, anyway, you can go on their website and they'll tell you how to do it. But you like rinse the bottle a couple times, then you put in your water. You rinse it a couple times with your water. I wouldn't use like soda, I would use like a water bottle. And then you just
They
send
will
it in.
send you a sampling
They will also send you
container,
a-
which is
a
what you
kit.
should do. And just to interrupt you for a second, if you're sampling for generic E. coli, you don't want to rinse the container that they send you, and you need to follow the lab's protocol
Yeah,
for
follow their
whatever
protocol.
they lay out. But yes, continue.
But it is
Sorry.
very inexpensive. And then I like the brewer's test because they give you more, just a little more data.
But so things to look at are, yeah, what your pH is, what if you're getting the generic E. coli, obviously those results, and then your alkalinity as well, which will usually be presented in ppm.
And this test might not be the 1603, the one that would count for gaps in bismuth.
Yeah, this is just like your,
Just to know.
Yeah.
yeah, your pH, your
Waters Ag does
alkalinity.
not currently offer generic E. coli testing that I know of. So you could send them a sample if you were already sending them tissue samples to get that broader water quality sample, or the brewer's sample that gives you some indication of your dissolved nitrates in that water, as well as a whole slew of nutrient availability, as well as pH and alkalinity, all that stuff as well.
Yeah, this is important not just for, well, it would be important if you're using that water for spraying, because you'd want to know those details, but in a high tunnel, which we'll talk about a little more when we go outside, you really want to know the water quality that you're putting in there, because if you have water that's super hard, then you're dumping all that calcium into that closed, a high tunnel is almost kind of a closed system in some ways, you have to kind of think of it that way. It's not really, because you can flush it, but if you're not doing that flush, then you're just, things are really building up in there quickly because you have no rain.
You stole my thunder, but yeah, I was going to get to that in the high tunnel, but that's all right. Which is, yeah, exactly that. I mean, you can think of it, it comes from limestone. That's where the word liming comes from. It's bicarbonate. You are impacting, you're basically putting on a liquid slurry of lime every time you're irrigating in a closed system where you're not getting any leaching, you're not getting any acidifying rain necessarily in there. So yeah, you can see your pH jump significantly in a high tunnel situation over the course of a couple of years. Even at a pH of around 7.5 or so, you can start to see that creep up. Again, depending upon the alkalinity of that water as well. That's where high alkalinity can even more radically impact what's happening in your soil, which impacts your nutrient availability.
Yeah, because then even if you're flushing, you're still flushing with high bicarbonate water.
Yeah.
So, because rain basically is doesn't really have much in it, right? Because it's been distilled, I guess, right? Rainwater doesn't have a lot of.
Depends, yeah. I mean, there are a lot of local, depending on what it's going through before it
Yeah.
gets to you. Yeah. Now that there's less sulfur in the environment, we're seeing that sulfur deficiencies in soils generally, but it's mostly from less sulfur coming down in acidified rain. Yes. So, and that's a good thing, even if it's a slight annoyance
Acid
from a
rain.
fertility and pH perspective for some growers. Yes.